Hello, MCU fans. Today we're going to take a look at a question that's honestly been bugging me ever since Quantumania came out with that post-credit scene, which is, what did He Who Remains do to the Kang Council? I mean, we see them in those post-credit scenes, and they're ready for revenge. They're really mad. But where have they been? Where did they go? Were they killed? Were they reincarnated? Were they locked in a dungeon? What on earth did He Who Remains do to them? Well, it turns out there's actually some new information, or maybe I should say old information, that perfectly answers that question. And it got me all the more excited for Loki Season 2 because it just wrapped everything up in a bow and just segues in beautifully into the new season. So I hope you enjoy this information as much as I did. Let's dive right in and see what we can find out. And then really quickly, I've been mentioning all month long, we are running a contest on the channel. All you have to do is be a subscriber, leave a comment on a video. The more videos you comment on, the more chances you have to enter, and I will announce a winner in early September on our video, and the winner will get to choose from one of these 3 books. So, best of luck. All right, so what I want to start with is He Who Remains' very, very helpful speech that he gave at the end of Loki Season 1. So let's review that very quickly. He says, "Eons ago, before the TVA, a variant of myself," I always like to point out, he's not saying I, he's saying a variant of myself, "lived in the 31st century. He was a scientist, and he discovered that there were universes stacked upon his own." Okay, great. At the same time, other versions of us were learning the same thing. Naturally, they made contact, and for a while there was peace. They shared technology and knowledge, using the best of their universes to improve the others. However, not every version of me was so pure of heart. To some of us, new worlds meant only one thing: new lands to be conquered. The peace between realities erupted into all-out war, each variant fighting to preserve their universe and annihilate the others. Okay, here's where it gets really important. That first variant, so again, he's not saying I, he's saying that first variant, encountered a creature created from all the tears in reality, capable of consuming time and space itself. Then finally he moves to first person, and he says, "I harnessed the beast's power and began experimenting on it. I weaponized Goliath, and I ended the Multiversal War." And then he says, "Once I isolated our timeline, all I had to do was manage the flow of time and prevent any further branches, hence the TVA, hence the timekeepers and the highly efficient bureaucracy, hence ages and ages of cosmic harmony, hence you're welcome." So, one important thing I want to point out here in the image, notice that he's showing the sacred timeline as a circle. I've always wondered, did he bend time into a circle, or is time always been a circle? You know, they talk about the Big Bang, then the Big Crunch, then the Big Bang, then the Big Crunch, that basically we're just in a loop. So my personal opinion is he did not form it in a circle, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think it's always been a circle, but regardless, it's very interesting that time is shown as a circle. Okay, I don't know if you picked up from this what he did to the Kang Council. I most certainly did not. So I thought, well, they didn't answer it. We're just going to have to figure it out later. Actually, we're going to find out they did. But there's a few more things we need to talk about first before we get to the answer. All right, so first I want to talk about an explanation of Nexus events from Michael Waldron. I love this. There's a Screen Crush article where literally Michael Waldron talks about both Loki and Heels. Yes, the same guy wrote Loki and wrote Heels. Don't ask. Anyway, we're not going to talk about Heels. You can go read the article if you want to talk about that. But Loki. All right. So I've mentioned this article before, but it's just so important. I feel like it's worth bringing up every time. Waldron says, and that's just how time works. There's always like different permutations and instances happening. The TVA has their own barometer, their own gauge for what constitutes a deviation from the baseline, the way it's supposed to go. The way it went that produced He Who Remains. That is their baseline. Great. So now we know what the sacred timeline is in that regard. Then, this is really important. He says, if you zoomed in on the timeline, it wouldn't necessarily look like a straight line. It might look like the intertwined strands of rope fluctuating and spiking here and there. So he's basically saying the sacred timeline is not one timeline, it's interwoven timelines that look like strands of rope. And actually, you know, if you look at the images we saw in Loki Season 1, that sure looks like more than one timeline, right? That is the sacred timeline before all the branching occurred, and it's a straight line, but there's multiple lines in there. Okay, so in my mind, that means there has always been multiple timelines in the sacred timeline because there have been mentions of the multiverse since the beginning of the MCU. If we go all the way back to Thor the Dark World, when Dr. Selvig went a little nutso, he was writing all kinds of crazy stuff on his chalkboard. In fact, Dr. Selvig, if you can just get out of the way, just thank you. Now, look at all this stuff on here. We have 616 universe. That's the first mention of the MCU being 616. The nexus of all reality, the fault, the crossroads. My goodness, all of these are terms that refer to the multiverse. So you got that, but this is just kind of hints, and you could argue the ravings of a madman, right? Well, they make it really clear in Doctor Strange. We have a multiverse. I mean, the Ancient One says this universe is one of only an infinite number, worlds without end, some benevolent and life-giving, others filled with malice and hunger, dark places where powers older than time lie ravenous and waiting. Who are you in this vast multiverse, Mr. Strange? So there had to be more than one timeline, i.e. universe, in the sacred timeline, or we wouldn't have had a multiverse in Doctor Strange. So Michael Waldron's quote makes total sense. I love it. Also, you even get this freaky-deaky image, which looks very much like branching timelines, right? Because you get his hand with fingers branching into hands with fingers, branching into hands with fingers, and it's just nastiness. But very interesting how this imagery looks so much like the imagery we saw when timelines split and branch. Very cool. So I would argue that the Spider-Man timelines were part of this original multiverse. There's no proof, so if you don't believe that, that is perfectly fine. But my headcanon, because I just think it's cool, is that part of the sacred timeline, the interwoven timelines, was the 3 Spider-Man universes, that they've always been there. So anyway, believe what you want on that. Doesn't really matter per se. But the key is, it is clear. There's more than one timeline in the sacred timeline. Okay, so now let's look at Nexus events. Next, he says, when it becomes a problem for the TVA is when, according to their own rules, when could something branch off in a way that could actually produce a new timeline that could produce a new version of He Who Remains? That's the practical thing they're guarding against. So what's important to note is, the stuff that Miss Minutes said, that was all propaganda when she was like, oh, if you're late to work, that's a Nexus event. Or if you start a war, that's a Nexus event, and all those crazy things. Nope. The only thing that creates a Nexus event in He Who Remains' mind is if that branch will create a new He Who Remains, a new Kang, because that's what he's trying to prevent. This all ties into, by the way, where the Kang Council went, the question we're trying to look into. This all ties in together. So it's only a Nexus event if it would create a new He Who Remains. Great. Then also, we learned from Miss Minutes and when she's teaching Loki, and I think this part is definitely got to be true. She says, what happens when a Nexus event branches past the red line? And Loki says, it's when the TVA can no longer reset a Nexus event. And then she prods him and he goes, and that would lead to the destruction of the timeline and the collapse of reality as we know it. I love that he says this so nonchalantly. It's like, wait, that's not good, right? That's not good at all. But what's important to note there is if the branch does not cross the red line, if they get rid of it before then you can wipe it out. However, if it passes the red line, now you have a problem because now it becomes an official timeline, an official universe in my mind, and that could produce a new He Who Remains. So they have only a certain amount of time to get rid of it. But if they didn't have that amount of time, there'd be no point to trying to prune, right? If as soon as it branched, boom, it was an official timeline, that wouldn't work. So I just think that's kind of interesting. Okay, now we need to talk briefly about these 4 statues that we saw in the Citadel at the end of time. Notice there's 3 that are intact and 1 that's broken. Let's talk about the 3 that are intact first. I think those were basically the timekeepers, or were reflecting the timekeepers, so which we saw in, of course, the animated form of the story of the multiverse, and then we saw as the animatronics that got beheaded there near the end of the season 1. But I think they were there to mock these 3. So basically, I'm pretty sure He Who Remains hung out with these 3 and others, but particularly with these 3, and eventually he isolated himself from them, which we're about to get to, but he mocked them then with those statues. I think the broken one is the exiled variant, the one from Quantumania. And the reason that's important is he was exiled before the Multiversal War ended, at least before He Who Remains isolated himself, because the variants knew that he was exiled, right? They knew where he went. So he's the exiled one. let's look at him a little bit because this is important. So what do we learn about him from Quantumania? Well, number one, he's holding a circle. So once again, there is time being reflected as a circle. I just don't think they made it a circle. I think time is a circle, but who knows, right? Anyway, he says, I saw their chaos spreading across realities, universes colliding, endless incursions. So here we are discussing the fact that ultimately, if they were allowed to keep messing around and doing what they were doing, we were going to have universes colliding and incursions. There's that incursion term. All right, that's all important. So Janet says, you mean you started a war? So basically, she's calling him out, and he doesn't deny it, as the one that started the Multiversal War. So, back earlier when we had He Who Remains walking through his story, and he said, a different variant than me. I think that variant is this Kang. I think that variant is the one that discovered everyone, discovered Eliath, and started the Multiversal War. He Who Remains ended it, but I think this exiled Kang is the one that started the war, because that's what she's saying, right? And in his mind, the way you start a war is demolishing everyone. I mean, we see him wiping people out, worlds wiped out, timelines wiped out. So we're going to see that is not how He Who Remains operates. That is how this Kang operated. That's why I think they are definitely different, because some people have theorized the exiled Kang might be He Who Remains. No, we're going to see they handle things very differently. So keep in mind, the exiled Kang, the way he solves it, kill everyone. All right. Now, then, Janet says he was exiled here in the quantum realm, which is outside space and time. So the last thing I want to talk about before we get to the answer, to this question of what happened to the Kang Council is, what on earth is up with the quantum realm, right? I mean, what is the quantum realm? Okay, so we get this interview from Jeff Loveness that is semi-helpful, I guess, when he says that it's the basement of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of the multiverse, I should say, sorry. We came up with this idea, he says at the bottom, that basically it's like the basement of the multiverse. It's this connected limbo outside space and time. So, I mean, if you want to say he's just wrong, that's fine. I mean, he wrote the movie, so I'm assuming he's right. But fine, you could write him off as just being wrong. But if he's right, then there is only one quantum realm for the whole multiverse, which makes sense because the Avengers used the quantum realm to do their time heist, which created a branch, and then to return back to their home universe again. So it can be used to jump timelines. We've seen that. But still, how is there only one? I mean, one thing people bring up all the time is, well, that doesn't work, because in What If, the Watcher explained that when Dr. Pym journeyed to the quantum realm in this particular universe, searching for his lost wife, she contracted the quantum virus that corrupted her brain, and of course, that's how we got the Marvel zombies. So then, does that mean it branched? The quantum realm branched? What's going on here? Well, number one, it could be they messed up. That's possible. But I do think there is a bigger issue at play here. How do you have one quantum realm that an infinite number of universes can enter and exit? Wouldn't all kinds of variants run into each other? I mean, sure, this zombie virus thing, this creates a problem. But you would have variants running into each other all the time. So there has to be a solution. Do I think they're ever going to give it to us? No, I do not. I think that the quantum realm is a giant plot device that does whatever they want it to do. That's unfortunate, but that seems to be the way it is. But I would throw out two possibilities. It could be that the quantum realm is so diverse and so big, you will never, in a millennium, run into a variant. So therefore, Janet did contract the virus, but it was the same quantum realm. It just, when she left with it, she then gave it to that universe. Believe me, I don't get it. I don't get how they can all be in here. But it's so big that different variants can be experiencing different things, and that's what happened. Janet, she got it, but other variants, like the Janet in our MCU, didn't catch it. Okay, that's possibly number one. Number two is maybe somehow you're out of phase with your variants, and so variants can never run into each other? I don't know. They're not going to explain it, though. That much is clear. Tell me what you think. But I really do believe they are firmly saying there is one quantum realm for the entire multiverse. All right. Also, we know the quantum realm's funky, right? Time is totally unpredictable. You have Janet going in 1987 and exiting in 2018, and she aged normally. You have Scott going into the quantum realm before the blip, being in there for 5 years and then coming out, but it was only like 5 hours for him. Okay? And then you have the ants in Quantumania, which apparently passed through some sort of time dilation, and they live thousands of years in a single day. Again, the quantum realm does whatever they want it to do. So I have no idea how one Janet got the zombie virus and the other Janet didn't. I don't. I'm just accepting the fact that Marvel is not going to explain the quantum realm. All right, great. There you go. Quantum realm is crazy. Okay, so now let's get to our answer. Where have these three been all this time? In fact, the whole Kang Council, for that matter. Where have they been? Were they killed? Were they reincarnated? Were they locked in the dungeon? Where did they go? Okay, we do know some things for sure. We know that they're aware of things that happened during the first Multiversal War because they know the Kang in the quantum realm was exiled. They talk about, so the exiled one is dead. So not only do they know what happened during the first Multiversal War, now that they're back and they can see what's going on, they know he died and they remember him. So it's kind of hard to believe they were killed because how would they remember what happened in the first Multiverse War? Well, thank goodness. This article, which has been out there for over 2 years, but I'd never seen it. Kate Herron, the director, answered the question. This is really cool. She says the idea with He Who Remains is that he's a variant of Kang the Conqueror. Basically, he tells them in his story that he managed to close himself off and isolate the timeline that we know from the other timelines. It's almost like they're on an island that's completely hidden from everyone else. He's been doing that to protect himself because he's afraid of the other variants of himself. Interesting. So basically what the director is telling us is He Who Remains managed to isolate the sacred timeline from the other timelines. And she basically called it like an island. So in my mind, it's like He Who Remains created a bunker and put landmines around it, a barbed wire fence, keep out signs, and a force field. So basically, no one else could get in. But there's a part of me that's like, okay, that's fine that you're explaining that, but why did you have to tell us that? Why didn't you tell us that in the actual show? Because that's kind of like important. Well, guess what? They did tell us. It's so obvious, and yet I totally missed it. So let's go back and look at what He Who Remains said. So, first of all, at the end of this, he says, I weaponized Goliath and I ended the Multiversal War. Well, I can tell you, I made a mistake because when I heard that as, oh, I weaponized Goliath and I killed everyone. I killed them all, every one of them. And it was just me left. He didn't say that. He just says he weaponized Goliath and he ended the Multiversal War. Then he goes on to say, once I isolated our timeline. Well, what do you know? There's the word. That's the same word Kate Herron used. He actually said it. I thought, again, isolated meant he went through and pruned off the little pieces until he perfectly had the sacred timeline. No, what he was saying, according to Kate Herron, and I believe her, she directed the show, and I'm sure worked with Michael Waldron, the writer, she's saying he, and she doesn't say how, and then hopefully they'll explain that, but more importantly, regardless of the how, he isolated the sacred timeline so that the other variants, the other Kangs, couldn't reach it. But he didn't kill them. He didn't wipe them out. And that's why I say there's no way in my mind that He Who Remains is the same variant as the Kang that was exiled. Because the Kang that was exiled, his solution was kill everyone. But here's He Who Remains basically going, nope. What I'm going to do is just protect myself. I'm going to bury myself in a hole and cover it up. And I got my sweet little sacred timeline, and I'm just going to make sure then no Nexus events can ever happen that result in a new He Who Remains. I don't care if there are branches. I don't care if there's multiple timelines, as long as none of them give me another He Who Remains. So I've isolated myself from the existing ones, and I'm preventing any new ones. Love it. Absolutely love it. This makes so much sense. So that explains that the Kang Council never went away. They weren't killed. They weren't reincarnated. They've always been there, but they were blocked off from the sacred timeline. Wow. Okay, so what else does she tell us? Well, she says, Loki variants all live in different realities, which then started to branch and go off the path that Loki was supposed to live. That became a problem for He Who Remains, and so the TVA would come in and remove those Lokis. In terms of the multiverse, as He Who Remains explains, so she again thinks he explained it, I just missed it. He isolated their timeline. But now, and this is really interesting, now because of what Sylvie's done, it's almost like it's going to branch. And then those branches are like bridges to other timelines where these other versions of He Who Remains will be. Fascinating. So she's basically saying the reason that what Sylvie did was so detrimental to the multiverse is, yeah, there was a multiverse when He Who Remains lived. It just was a nice, safe multiverse, safe from all these variants. When he died, now the branches are literally forming bridges to those other timelines. Whoa, that's cool. Now, this part they didn't really say, but they did show it to us. If you think about it, we saw the sacred timeline, which branched and branched even more, and then branched into insanity. And it now sheds new light on something Kevin Feige said about No Way Home and Multiverse of Madness. Kevin Feige said, He Who Remains is gone, and that allowed a spell to go wrong in Spider-Man No Way Home, which leads to the entire multiverse going quite mad in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. So what I'm interpreting now, taking into account what Kate Herron said, is Doctor Strange's spell actually wouldn't have even caused a problem before He Who Remains was killed. I mean, the reason the spell failed is because there were so many branches forming between the different timelines. Things were overlapping with each other, and that was creating the problems. So, I mean, Doctor Strange still really messed up, but I don't think his spell would have caused that problem, except for the fact that now all these branches were forming, and the divisions between the different timelines were breaking down. In fact, let's look, and this even makes more sense, at this statement Reed Richards made in Multiverse of Madness. An incursion occurs when the boundary between two universes erodes and they collide, destroying one or both entirely. And sure, he goes on to talk about how Doctor Strange created an incursion by coming into a different universe. But forget that for the minute. That's not even the worst problem. The worst problem is all of the boundaries between the universes are eroding and they're colliding. That's what Kate Herron was saying, makes total sense, and that's why we're going to have so many incursions regardless of who's jumping around between the universes. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So, yeah, there you go, right? We're seeing this total mess at the end of Quantumania, and that's what's causing this problem, is all the branches forming between the timelines, the bridges forming. So, one big thing we don't know yet, and I suspect we won't get the answer in Loki Season 2, but I just kind of want to point it out, is where is the council located? So the three main Kangs, and then the whole council, right, where all these people are meeting. This is obviously not the Citadel at the end of time, but they can see out the window, they can see the multiverse cracking there. You can kind of see it beyond the clouds there. So where is this located? We don't know. They haven't told us yet. I'm fine with waiting for that answer. But I just kind of want to point out that that's a good question, is where are they? But the point is, they've always been around. They just could not access the sacred timeline. They were walled off from it. That means they also were probably unaware of what was happening with the exiled Kang until now that the multiverse is branching and connecting with the bridges. Now they can see that Kang was dead, and they're really frustrated. And of course, they're blaming, humanity. They're blaming Earth. They're blaming all the heroes for causing this, for tapping into the multiverse. All right, so one more thing she said that is kind of interesting. It's worth pointing out. I'm not sure I agree with it. I'm not sure she agrees with it. But she says, in my head, the way I see it is that when Sylvie pushes him, Loki, through the door with all the chaos outside the window, there were all these branches crossing over into different realities, and he's definitely not in the reality that he was before. So she's answering the question of where did Loki go at the end? Because remember, he shows up in this different reality, where it's a different statue, where Mobius and Hunter B-15 don't recognize him. So where did he go? Well, she's saying a different reality, although she was even saying in my head. So I'm not sure it's confirmed, But I am certain they will answer this in Loki season 2. I'm beginning to wonder if instead this time slipping, this, look at that nastiness. It's just so gross. If this is really what happened, if he slipped to a point in time before anybody knew him, before Mobius and the hunters knew him. But notice they're saying about time slipping is it's impossible to time slip in the TVA. I know, but we just saw it happen. So it'd be interesting to see how all this ties together. I am certain they're going to wrap all that up. And perhaps, Kate Herron was even just saying, maybe she's being intentionally misleading because she didn't want us to know the real answer. Anyway, I would take that last bit with a grain of salt, but I think she perfectly explained the answer to the question of where the Kang Council went. They went nowhere. They just were trapped, or they were unable, rather, I should say, to access the sacred timeline. And it showed us that the reason that now it's all interweaving is because the bridge is formed from all the craziness. Okay, so I'm going to kind of wrap all this up into a nice diagram. I used this in my video from 6 months ago, and now I've updated it to incorporate all the new information. So basically we have a timeline, because I think it all started from one timeline ultimately, going all the way up to the 31st century where the Kangs are, and then down below we have a quantum realm, which is just a giant red box because it's a hot mess, right? It does whatever we want it to do. All right, so over time, we had all kinds of branches forming, right? And branches off of branches, and branches off of branches off of branches. Ultimately, that leads in the 31st century to the three Kangs, of the main Kangs of the Kang Council, He Who Remains, and, of course, the exiled Kang. I'm sure a bunch more Kangs, we know that, but these are the main five. Okay, so I believe it was the exiled Kang that found Alioth, based on He Who Remains narration, and he started the Multiversal War. They all got sick of him, so they jettisoned him into the quantum realm. So that's going to be like a little poof. It's going to stay there for a while. We're going to get rid of him, but that poof is to remember he's there. We'll come back to him. All right. Then He Who Remains managed to weaponize Alioth and used it to end the Multiversal War, which again doesn't mean he killed everyone, but he isolated himself from them. So I'm going to basically say those three are all of these branches. So he basically isolated himself from those timelines. So now we have the sacred timeline, which again is composed of multiple timelines. I think the top three are Spider-Man and Venom, the two Spider-Men and the Venom. But anyway, so now everything's happy, right? He creates the TVA on the top. He's got Alioth guarding the Citadel at the end of time, and he's hanging out there just chilling like a villain. All right, so now time starts moving forward. In 1987, Janet ends up going into the quantum realm, as we know. And while she's there, she ends up meeting up with, boom, Kang, right? The blip turns into Kang. So they spend some time together. She ends up destroying his multiversal core because he realizes he's a bad dude. And then she's on the run from him. And then finally she gets out in 2018. Of course, the exiled Kang continues on. We'll pick up his story eventually. But for now, he's just moving on. Okay, so then in 2023, the time heist occurs, right? And they use the quantum realm to jump back in time to multiple time periods, 2012, 2013, 2014, even 1970, but I'm really going to focus on 2012 because that's the most important one. While they're there, they created a branch, and they had to create a branch, as I've said before, because, they said, Hail Hydra. Captain America said, Hail Hydra to Sitwell. He tells himself that Bucky's alive. It's just carnage. It has to be a branch because all of those things would have affected the main timeline. So it's really important because that branch results in another branch where Loki steals the Tesseract and he creates a branch on a branch, right? The TVA comes in and says, okay, that's a problem. We need you taken care of. So they bring him into the TVA and they prune his branch. It gets tricky pruning a branch without pruning, or a branch off a branch without pruning the original branch, I realize. But nonetheless, that had to be what happened. All right, so then after their craziness, they return to 2023, and then eventually Steve Rogers is going to go back, return all the stones, and that is theoretically going to prune all those branches. We really, really need to see that adventure. Please, Marvel, I keep hearing rumors. We might get to see that adventure. Oh, that'd be incredible. But nonetheless, that's what they explained would happen, so I'm just going to trust those are gone. It kind of doesn't really matter, but nonetheless, I think they're all gone. Okay, now, ultimately, the TVA pulls in Sylvie, or really more from a result of what Loki's doing, Sylvie gets to the main TVA. Then the two of them head over and fight Goliath and ultimately tame him. I don't know whether he's killed or not, but at a minimum, he's kind of, dispersed for the time being, so we'll get rid of him. They then head to the Citadel at the end of time, and they run into He Who Remains. So, during a fight between Sylvie and Loki, Sylvie shoves Loki through a portal, and now he's in wherever he is, right? That's an open question. We don't know, and we're surely going to learn that in Loki Season 2. But that's where Loki's left off. Sylvie, on the other hand, kills He Who Remains, which creates the carnage. So we leave her in the Citadel at the end of time. That's the last we saw her. So once again, I think that's also going to get picked up in Loki Season 2. So I think we'll get that answered. Okay, now, because of all of the carnage and the bridges being formed between timelines, now these guys who have always been around, they never went away, they just could not access the sacred timeline. Now they're able to. Now their timelines are branching into our timeline, etc., etc. We got a real mess on our hands. Okay, then we move to 2026 when Janet and team all headed into the quantum realm. They run into Kang the Conqueror. He ends up dying. I mean, I don't think he died. I think he's going to turn into the Beyonder myself because I think he fell into that multiversal core and he's going to get infinite power. But nonetheless, we don't know. All we know is something happened. And then Janet and the team all ultimately return back to 2026. And so that's the time when the Council, who's always been around, again, they've always been around, but now they realize, whoa, he was killed. What's going on? They've tapped into the multiverse. We need to do something. And so they bring in the full Kang Council. Whew. And that's where we left off. So I really do think it all fits. That missing piece, that interview from Kate Herron, which straightened my mind around to help me understand what He Who Remains actually did say originally, it all makes sense. Man, this gets me so excited for Loki Season 2 because I really do think they have a plan. I really do think they're thinking this through and they're going to keep it going forward and we're going to have a fantastic season. So, speaking of, now we wait for Loki Season 2. Bring it on, baby. It cannot get here soon enough. All right, so really quick mentioning again, there's a contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment. Best of luck. And as always, I like to bring up the fact that we do have a Discord server. I will leave a pinned comment so you can join if you'd like. Here we are talking about the timelines and all the craziness. We have a metaphysics, basically, chat where we talk all this stuff. So lots of fun. Love to have you join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we can all continue to enjoy the ever-changing, ever-growing Marvel Cinematic Universe.